Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. Hello everybody, welcome back. Today I have some fantasy romance recommendations for you. This is Cosmo. He's my beautiful giant schnauzer. He is 3 years old. He'll be 4 years old this February. And he loves being on camera and he just wanted to say hello. Hi baby. Yes. Okay. Sorry for that. So today's video is a collaboration with Tori from A Novel Life. I'm very, very excited about doing this video with her, and I'm very excited about the topic because it's fantasy romance, which is one of my favorite subgenres. I adore fantasy books, and then you combine fantasy with romance. It's my favorite thing ever. So I will have her channel and video linked down below, so make sure you go and check her out for her recommendations, and let's go ahead and get started. So the first book that I have to recommend is Daughter of No Worlds by Carissa Broadbent. This is a recent read of mine and one that I super enjoyed. I felt like the world building in here was really beautifully well done and rich. It wasn't by any means hastily thrown together. I think that of all the books that I have on this list, some of them have a little bit more in-depth world building and some are a little bit lighter. This one is one of the more in-depth fantasy worlds. Not saying so much that the fantasy elements are like hard, but there's a lot of political intrigue in here and a lot of slowly building and developing story. And the romance also was slow building and slow burn, and it really didn't come into play until the very end. But if you love great fantasy, I think you will still like this because it was fantastic. So the basic premise is Tizana, our heroine, who was sold into slavery as a young girl, and she has finally earned enough money to buy her freedom. So the night that she is buying her freedom, her owner basically refuses to let her go, and in this moment where she's left with very little options, she ends up killing him and has to run and escape. She ends up joining the Order, which is basically a group of people like a rebel of the political world. They're like the rebels who are trying to bring them down. She joins them and she ends up becoming the apprentice to a master magic wielder who is a fire wielder. And he is a grumpy hero for sure. He doesn't want to have anything to do with politics or the Order, but he finds himself compelled and also roped into helping to train her. And so it has that little bit of master and apprentice, and that's the romance that develops, and I just really, really loved that. I felt like this was just beautifully written. It was very compelling. I loved the heroine, and I also loved the hero, and I was just super invested in this world. There's also something that comes into play in the plot in the last, third or quarter towards the end that I found was just fascinating and I wanted to know more. So I enjoyed this one a ton and I would highly recommend it. Okay, the next book that I have to recommend is technically a sci-fi romance, but I mean, you could call it a fantasy romance for sure. And it's Desire in His Blood by Zoe Draven. This is the beginning of a new series for her, so if you haven't read any of her previous works, you could definitely pick up here. It's basically about this human family living on this planet, and the daughter, the eldest daughter, is the heroine. She's sort of been running her family's finances and trying to keep them afloat because her dad is terrible at gambling and losing money, and they are very, very severely in debt. And so a marriage proposal comes along with the hero, who is from an alien race from another planet, and I picture him to be like a mix between a vampire and a gargoyle. Like, he's also a berserker, so he's just huge, and he has these really powerful forms that he shifts into when he becomes a berserker, and he's very intimidating to the humans. He is the one who proposes this marriage alliance with the heroine because he has a secret vendetta against her father. She doesn't know that. So when they get married, this is definitely a case of enemies to lovers, and I really, really loved watching them navigate that relationship and watching him especially sort of crumble and fall for her, even though he was determined not to and to get revenge on her father, and he finds himself really questioning, how am I going to actually get my revenge? Do I even want to? Because I'm starting to care for her. And this book was also extremely hot, and I just loved it so freaking much. It was one of the funnest books I've read in a long time. Okay, the next book that I have is Wolfskin by Juliette Marillier. So this again is, Juliette Marillier is, you know, traditionally she's a fantasy author first, but this is the only book I've read from her, and this had a really beautiful, sweet, luscious romance towards the end. I adored it so much. I loved the characters in here, I loved the plot, I loved the world that it was in. It's basically sort of a spin on Thor and Loki, as you have these two best friends who become blood brothers, one is so good, like straight and narrow. He wants to be a wolfskin, which is sort of like this highly trained warrior for Thor, and his brother is Summerled, who is, you know, like Loki, basically. He's not necessarily mischievous, but he has this undercurrent of like evil or darkness about him and a thirst for power. But their brotherhood, their friendship is both at times unsettling and endearing, and that's what propels the story forward as Summerled wants to overtake this island and demolish the people there. And that's when Ivan, the hero, is really conflicted about what does it mean to actually be a brother and keep an oath, and he has all these feelings for these people on this island, which is where he meets the heroine, who is a priestess there. And it was just so richly complex and detailed, and I absolutely loved this. I know I've mentioned this on a lot of videos recently, but maybe that will just let you know how much I loved it. Like, if you were looking for just an excellent Norse mythology, historical fantasy with a sweet, beautiful romance, and you are, you know, it's a pretty long book, but it didn't feel long to me. But if you're committed to something like that, I think you would really enjoy this. Especially, I think, if you're a fan of historical romances and you like want to try some fantasy, I think you would like this too, because it does have historical vibes for sure. Okay, so the next book that I have to recommend is one that is all over right now, all over the bookish social media world. It just barely released. It's Anastasia by Sophie Lark. So this is Sophie Lark's first fantasy book and her first fantasy romance, and I went into this book with a little bit of trepidation. I got an arc of this. I felt super lucky. It took me several days to read because this is quite long, but it is on Kindle Unlimited. And I absolutely loved it. Like, I became obsessed with this book. Sophie's books never fail to captivate me. I'm always transported into whatever world she's creating. I think that she is a fantastic writer. And one of the things she does really well, in my opinion, is character building and character development. And that was so evident here as we follow Anastasia, you know, both from the Romanoff family and from the cartoon. We follow Anastasia from the time she's a child until she grows up and becomes an adult, and she steps into her power and also tries to heal her country and her family. So this was beautiful, and it wasn't a complete surprise because I felt like I was gonna like it, but I was definitely very impressed with Sophie's first foray into fantasy. And again, this is another book that is long, that feels richly historical in setting with fantasy elements and romance there, but if you are okay with a slow building romance and you want a rich historical setting with great fantasy elements, like, I cannot recommend this book enough. I think it was fantastic. There were some twists, there were some spins I wasn't expecting, and the emotion in this book was so palpable. I just adored it, and I'm sure everybody else is going to be talking about it or recommending it, but I had to throw it in here too, so. Okay, the next book that I have to recommend is Of Goblins and Gold by Emma Hamm. Emma Hamm is a wonderful fantasy romance author. I really enjoy her books. She is another one who typically has a really good sense of history in her fantasies. So, like, she does do some... She's pretty much known for her Celtic mythology fantasy romances, and I've read one of those and really enjoyed it. This one is sort of a spin on the Goblin Market poem and also a bit of a nod to Labyrinth, as this is about our heroine who and her sister who go to the Goblin Market one night. Her sister steals a necklace, and then she gets kidnapped by the Goblin King, taken to their land, and the sister has to try and get her back. So she goes, talks to the Goblin King, makes a deal, and has to perform 4 tasks to get her sister back. So this is a short book, and it is a series, so this ends on a cliffhanger. I kind of wish it didn't, but I still just absolutely enjoyed this lyrical, beautiful writing in here. And something that I really like about Emma Hamm's book is how she blends this sort of whimsical fairy tale type of story with the darker side of fairy tales. Like, I think she mashes those up really well. It never feels overly lighthearted, and it never feels overly dark. I think she has a really good blend of that, and I think her romances are particularly swoony. She is a fan of a slow burn romance, so be prepared for that. If you're going to start this book, like, I highly recommend it if you want Goblin Market, Labyrinth vibes. But just be aware that it does end on a cliffhanger, and all of the books in the series are pretty short. So, it was fantastic. I thought it was a good time. Okay, the next book that I have is The Barbarian King's Assassin. So, I love a good barbarian fantasy romance. Heart of Blood and Ashes is one of my favorite books of all time. I just love that book so much. And this one, I was kind of trepidatious about it, if I was going to like it or not. And I was pleasantly surprised by this. This is much, much, much lighthearted than A Heart of Blood and Ashes. Like, I wouldn't even really compare the two. They're totally different in tone, but I mean, barbarians, that's the similarity there. So this one was very intriguing. This was a very fast-paced book, and I thought the romance was fantastic, and I just really enjoyed it. The heroine is an assassin, and she's sent on a mission to go and kill the barbarian king. And he is so impressed with her and how she almost got him. And he's like this big, massive, powerful warrior. He was so impressed with how she almost killed him that he's like, hey, how about you just be my bodyguard and you don't kill me? And then she does, and then plot unfolds, and they end up falling in love. So this was lighthearted, even though there were some dark moments. You know, it's still a barbarian fantasy, but it felt overall pretty lighthearted and just a really fun, fast-paced read that I enjoyed. And also, like, cover appreciation. Beautiful cover, right? I just adore it. Okay, so now the next book that I have is Sword Heart by T. Kingfisher. Again, I've talked about this book a lot lately because I love T. Kingfisher. I think that she's just a fantastic writer. This is my favorite book of hers that I've read so far, and this one is probably the only one that I would really sell to romance readers because the fantasy element and the romantic element were pretty much equal in here. I thought they were both really, really well done. This book, again, is very lighthearted and fun and funny, and it's just like, honestly, this was just such a fun read. One of those books, again, that just had me smiling, and I just was engaged the whole time, and I just loved it. Our heroine is a housekeeper who suddenly inherits her great uncle's estate, and she ends up having some relatives come to town who sort of want to force her to marry one of their relatives so they can get the estate, and they end up locking her in this room, and she doesn't want to be married to them because she wants her freedom, she wants her own house, and she doesn't even like the guy. So she's locked in this room, and as is typical of a dramatic historical fantasy woman, she says, well, I'm locked in here. I refuse to marry him. There's a great sword up on the wall. I'm gonna just impale myself on the sword, and then I will die, and then I won't have to marry him. So she gets the sword down, puts it to her breast, and as soon as she does, out of the sword comes this giant warrior who is immediately taken aback because, of course, she took her blouse off so she could, you know. And he's like, what is happening? Like, he's used to, when he's called out of the sword, he's used to just going straight into battle. And he's like, I'm in a bedroom with a woman with her top off and I don't know what to do. And it is just like adorable. And that's how the whole tone of the book is. Like, there definitely are some serious moments, and then they go on this quest together, and it's just a good time. They have such a great relationship. There's so much good banter, and it's just honestly fun. And I loved it, you know, so. Another book that I'm going to just briefly mention that is also a fantasy romance and is by T. Kingfisher is Nettle and Bone. This one I think is less romantic than Sword Heart, but it's shorter, and this will give you sort of a taste for T. Kingfisher's writing. And also, this was just mystical, magical, quirky, and just overall entrancing, and I just really enjoyed it. And then honorable mention to an entire series, because this is probably my favorite fantasy series that also has an amazing romance, although it takes the entire trilogy to come to fruition, and it is the Bear and the Nightingale series. I adore this series so freaking much. The first book is The Bear and the Nightingale, the second is The Girl in Tower, and the third is The Winter of the Witch, and this book is when the romance finally hits it, and it's fantastic. But it's basically a story of a girl whose family is sort of not necessarily possessed, but influenced by a demon. This is deeply influenced by Russian mythology and magic, and it's just absolutely beautifully written. It's creepy at times, it's unsettling at times, the fantasy is perfect, but it's the romance between the daughter as she's sort of trying to save her family and a frost demon. It's perfect. I love it so much. So if you haven't read the series, or if you haven't continued on in the series and you're a romance reader and you were like, there's not enough romance in here, you need to get to that one because it's so freaking good. So, alright, there you have it. Those are my fantasy romance recommendations. Thank you so much for watching this video, my friend. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you made it this far, please feel free to leave me like a sword or a dagger or something, and I'll see y'all in my next video.